pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you both, CB and Shankar. I really enjoyed reading your book on corporate responsibility. I think it offers a great framework and a strong evidentiary base spanning lab experiments, the recent headlines, financial economics. I guess I'd like to start by asking you why you think CEOs, board members, stakeholders more broadly are increasingly focused on corporate responsibility and hungry for the kind of framework that you provide in this book.
One of the reasons is that stakeholders today are increasingly conscious of not just buying a good product, but also kind of where does the product come from? So who's the company that stands behind the product? So that's something that we've seen in the consumer space. And so there's increasing pressure on companies to kind of deliver and make themselves, look responsible in the eyes of the market. The same way employees today, they don't want just a paycheck. I mean, they want something more from a company. They want a sense of fulfillment in terms of where they work. So companies, again, even in a reactive mode, they have to kind of, get into the act of being good corporate citizens. Investors, as an investor movement as well. So multiple stakeholders have, or you can say society as a whole, have kind of risen up to the idea that we need to be more responsible as organizations and as corporate citizens. And all of that has put of course, the global warming and the climate change movement, all of this, the human rights, everything has come together to kind of suddenly catapult corporate responsibility, I guess, to the forefront.
Great. And what motivated you personally to meet this demand by writing this book? How did you personally become interested in the topic?
I met the CEO of Ben & Jerry's, Ben Cohen, a long time ago in the mid-90s, and he asked a very interesting question of me. And he said, can you tell me whether consumers would buy our brand rather than a competitor's brand because of the things that we are doing in the social and environmental realm? Being a marketing scholar, this was clearly a marketing question, but I had never thought of social responsibility as a driver of consumer purchase. And that's when I looked to my good friend here and I said, okay, maybe we need to kind of do something about this. And indeed, that was our first kind of dive into this area of corporate responsibility and how stakeholders react to companies' corporate responsibility initiatives. Over the years, there are many other companies who came to us with similar questions, P&G, General Mills, Target, Danone. I mean, all of these companies kind of seemed to have similar questions in mind. And so our body of work just kind of kept growing. Plus, the whole theoretical space was wide open. So there was question after question that one could answer. And at some point, it looked like, hey, I mean, we've got a portfolio here that perhaps we can distill kind of and disseminate the findings to a wider audience than just those who read scholarly journals.
And I think as an academic, one of the things I saw that was missing in this space is what CB talked about, which is the lack of an academic or conceptual perspective and rigor to a lot of the work that I was seeing and we were seeing in this area. And so we thought that was a really interesting opportunity to kind of bring some of that as academics, given our unique backgrounds, to the questions that were raised in this area.
So do you think the two main differences between this book and some of the other pieces in the field are this academic focus and the marketing as a discipline, or are there other key differentiators of the book?
Those are two of the key ones, yes.
I mean, the stakeholder perspective is of course, I think, a big differentiator of this book from others. No one really has, or prior to this, no one really had studied consumers and employees to find out kind of from the eyes of the beholder, if you will, kind of, what do they feel about a company's corporate responsibility. If you look at websites, every company says that they're doing great work and fantastic work, but this was an opportunity to kind of look at it from the other side. And what we found was, as you can tell from the book, quite telling. So I would add to that the fact that we're looking at it through the lens of the stakeholder is a big differentiator.
I was curious about the labeling. There's so many top labels thrown around: responsibility, social responsibility, sustainability. How do you differentiate corporate responsibility from some of these other topics, these other labels?
the way I address it typically is that corporate responsibility is kind of a means to an end, and the end would really be sustainability, where we are thinking of the people, the planet, and as businesses, of course, we're thinking of profit. So that triple bottom line is where we want to get to, and companies are but one of the agents that can kind of take us there. And when companies engage in what it takes to get to fulfill that triple bottom line, we call that corporate responsibility. We've clarified that kind of in the book in very simple terms. And because we are not dealing with the other actors, such as responsible consumerism, I mean, that's a big field in of itself that's emerging now, or any social entrepreneurship, which is another thing that's kind of leading into it. We figured that corporate responsibility was perhaps the best label and the most honest label for us in this book.
Okay. You ground a lot of the analysis in the book at the level of the individual, drawing on psychological research and experiments, including many that you've conducted yourself. Could you highlight some of the key insights that come out of this research for people who are interested in corporate responsibility?
Well, we from the very beginning, we took a very contingent approach in trying to understand stakeholder reactions. Our basic premise was that not everyone is going to react the same way, which is very consistent with our understanding of how human beings behave and think and react to not only what companies do, but what happens in the world around them. So in that sense, so that's the approach that we took. And what we found were, as is summarized in the book, there were some key insights. The first is that a lot of the people we talked to were not really fully understanding of what exactly companies were doing. So awareness was very low. We found that even when they knew what was happening, there were certain dimensions of their understanding that really mattered when it came to how stakeholders, particular consumers, react to what companies do. That included things like what kind of attributions they made about why a company is doing what it's doing, which is very key, as you know, in this space. It also related to what expectations they had coming into what a company should be doing. So those were some of the things. And then finally, one of the key things that we thought what we found really mattered is are the consumers feeling that what the companies are doing really does something for them personally? And that's very much in line with the entire perspective on consumer needs and things like that. So I would say those are the key things. Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, in simple terms, we are able to distill this into the form of a model that folks might find easier to remember, and we call it the 3 U's model, and we label them understanding, usefulness, and unity. And unity is really the sense of belongingness between the company and the individual, which drives outcomes such as kind of loyalty, positive word of mouth, resilience to negative information. So we studied outcomes that are really of interest to businesses. I mean, businesses have been coveting these outcomes for a long time. And what we are able to do through this micro-psychological perspective is we are able to show that corporate responsibility indeed can contribute to these outcomes even when you hold, all else constant. So we are able to show fairly convincingly that this is an additional driver of kind of, marketing and business coveted outcomes.
One of the things that's interesting is you're able to draw a contrast. You're able to say it's not just what the company is doing that may or may not be responsible, but how it's perceived. And so the perceptions among consumers and employees are really what drives outcomes. That gives a real prominence to the media strategy and the communication strategy that the company employs. Can you speak a little bit about your findings there?
Yeah, I mean, communication becomes absolutely key. I mean, as I said, one thing was that, first of all, we found awareness to be low. And a very simple truth is that if people don't know what you are doing, there is no way that they can reward you. So companies will have to work on increasing that awareness. However, that's a slippery slope, because in our research we found that stakeholders oftentimes receive these messages as kind of propaganda from companies or self-promotion. So one of the implications that we kind of highlight in the book is that when it comes to talking about your corporate responsibility, tell, don't sell. So don't try to make more of it than you actually have, but rather give the facts out there. What we find is that stakeholders really want companies to be outcome focused rather than input focused. And what that means is that don't say that we are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on solving this crisis, but rather say that we've actually saved 100 lives, or we've kept 200 people warm from the cold winter. So if you focus on what you've achieved as a company in the corporate responsibility realm, that makes a much bigger difference than kind of if you just keep on saying that yes, we are trying. So we do list these implications, which if companies follow that in their communication strategy and media strategy, I think they can navigate what's a reasonably complicated path. It's not straightforward because, unlike advertising, which everybody accepts as okay, companies trying to sell stuff. When it comes to corporate responsibility, there's far more skepticism. And what we are able to do in the communication strategies is we are suggesting kind of ways to navigate this path and achieve kind of a good outcome for the companies.
The one thing I would add to that is also, in terms of communication, one of the things we found is that if you can really address in your communications what is it that you're doing in terms of the needs of your consumers or your stakeholders, and if you can address that very clearly. I don't know if you remember the Shell example that we had in one of the earlier chapters, where we think one of the key issues there was that they did not really think about, okay, what is it that this community needs as we're trying to do good in the environmental space, and they didn't communicate that effectively. So,
and what form of media? Are we talking about using broadcast media, using printed media, using social media? How do you integrate these different forms of the communication strategy to target individual stakeholders with the message of the outcomes and your efforts in this area?
I think it spans all of them. In our book, at this point, we did not get into that level of the kind of the media planning strategy and kind of at what point or with which target segment a particular media strategy might be more effective than another. I think that would have to be kind of on a case-by-case basis, depending on the company and the context. If you look at the real world, there is a fair amount of print media as far as corporate responsibility is concerned. And that's clearly an important one because people do get a little bit of time to kind of process the information that's given. But social media clearly, things like Facebook and so on have become also increasingly prominent. I don't think that the implications that we've come up with are kind of more applicable to a certain form of media or less applicable to a certain form of media, but rather I think it's best to say that we would work that out depending on a particular company context.
And I think one of the key points we make is that when it comes to your media strategy, you have to, again, segment your stakeholders in your market in terms of what messages you want to go to which group, at what stage of the evolution of your corporate responsibility initiatives. So, if you take Nestle as an example, they identify thought leaders in the space and they send them personal communications, whereas they might put out general ads and then they have their corporate responsibility reports. So it's really a mixture of, and then they have to address, if an NGO attacks them in the social media space, they'd have to be savvy enough to address that issue in that space.
Throughout the book, you provide a wealth of great anecdotes and experiences of individual companies with whom you've worked. I wonder how different you feel the perception in the C-suite is about the importance of sustainability, corporate responsibility from the classroom, from future managers, and what explains that gap?
Well, recent evidence suggests that the C-suite is taking notice of what's going on. There was a recent study by Accenture that was actually published in Business Week where they surveyed CEOs and C-suite managers, and they all had very strong, unequivocal concerns about kind of sustainability and the important role that sustainability would play kind of in the corporate world kind of in the years to come. Are they actually going to take note of the details? No, perhaps not. So for them, the message is very simple from our book. I think for the C-suite, the message is that the only way corporate responsibility makes a difference both to society as well as to the bottom line of the company is if it is fully integrated into the strategy of the company, that it ought not to be kind of a bolt-on. And if you give it that respect, and if you think about it similar to what you would think about your business strategy overall, then and only then can you actually create value. And one important message that we emphasize is that the only way to creating value through corporate responsibility, business value through corporate responsibility, is to create social value first. So creating social value, and when I say social, I mean environmental as well. So creating social and or environmental value is a prerequisite to creating business value through corporate responsibility. In other words, there are no shortcuts. And if this is a message that we can actually communicate to the C-suite in simple terms, and I have some tangible examples of where managers have taken one slide kind of, from our presentation and say, okay, this is the one we're going to show. Then I think, all they need to do is to then, go down the chain of command and say, okay, guys, we need to think about this a little bit differently, and then hopefully we'll make a difference.
So this bears a lot of similarity to Michael Porter's recent work on shared value with Mark Kramer. It's a seductive appeal to say we can do well, create profits, and create value for all stakeholders. But at the end of the day, we also have to capture that value for our shareholders, capture our share of it. If we just create social welfare, if we just create total benefits, how do we know that in the end we'll sustain ourselves as a company? So what advice do you have in terms of making sure that the company captures its share of the value it's creating as opposed to it all being distributed to external stakeholders?
In the approach we take, I mean, if you think about the outcomes that we study, I mean, if a consumer is more loyal to the company's products or says good things about the company, then that value is accruing to the company. I mean, in our framework, we are looking at social value and environmental value, and we are looking at business value. So, and our models and statistical models as well as the conceptual frameworks are able to demarcate, between the creating value for the society part as well as creating value for the company part. So when an employee basically stays longer at the company or is going to be more productive, which we are also able to show statistically, then that value is essentially being, essentially being captured or is accruing to the company, and we don't see that danger of it being lost.
I think it comes back to the basic premise of our book, which is that there is a demand for corporate responsibility and sustainability from the companies, from the external stakeholders. And so if a company does that, then the stakeholders will reward them because their needs are being fulfilled.
It's also obvious from reading the book that you're drawing a lot on statistical studies, lab experiments. I wonder, if there's one that you think is particularly powerful that you'd like to share with us and share with the audience.
One. All right. Yeah. Well, you start.
The one that stands out for me always is the work that we did with yogurt companies, yogurt brands. We contrasted Stonyfield, which is very well known for its work in the corporate responsibility space, with other brands which actually are, you could argue, equally involved, but are not really positioned completely or not fully identified with that. And what we found was very interesting in that the consumers of Stonyfield felt much closer to the brand, identified, felt more unity with the brand, and ultimately rewarded the brand more than consumers of the other brands, even though all the other brands were quite actively engaged in corporate responsibility. And I think to me that really encapsulates the essence of the book, which is that if you really understand your stakeholders, if you really know what they're looking for, and if you can deliver on that as part of your corporate responsibility initiatives, then that's going back to your previous question, that's going to help you capture more of the value from it than if you're just kind of doing it in a sort of scattershot way.
Let me add a quick one, if I may. And this is a different methodology, and this was a secondary data study where, with another co-author actually, not the three who wrote the book, but with another co-author, I studied Fortune 1000 companies, and what we did was we related corporate responsibility to the market value of the firm. And what we found there was that there were these interesting interactions between corporate responsibility and the product quality of the firm and innovativeness of the firm. And this data we got from Fortune's most admired companies. And it turned out that corporate responsibility positively contributed to market value only in those contexts where the firm was perceived to have good product quality and was perceived to be innovative, which is interesting because it shows that mere engagement in corporate responsibility does not necessarily yield to kind of better business returns for the company. But you have to, as a company, you have to have your house in order, so to speak, and you have to make sure that the fundamentals such as product quality and innovation must be also up to snuff, before a firm goes out and kind of engages in corporate responsibility. So this one helps to tie the role of corporate responsibility with other kind of strategic elements of the firm in a very nice way, and again, kind of makes it easier for senior management to see why corporate responsibility actually needs to be integrated into the business strategy.
Great. What do you think is the most important point managers need to remember about corporate responsibility that should guide their actions today and in the future?
Okay. They should basically remember that, again, corporate responsibility has to be thought of in terms of a long-run strategy, that it's not something that gives immediate returns. You cannot make a difference in the immediate run, and you have to kind of work hard at it. So if there's one thing we learned from the book, is that it pays to be responsible only when your stakeholders perceive that there's some difference that you're making to the community and to the environment. So the sincerity of the firm is kind of, is absolutely has to be unquestionably there. And if you make that difference, then and only then can you reap the value. So we say that there is value to be extracted, but it's not kind of there to be grabbed. It's not simple. So you have to kind of work hard and make a difference to society and the environment to kind of get that value out. But it's a win-win for all. So the triple bottom line is not a zero-sum game, in other words, which seems to be kind of a belief in the corporate world, that if we do invest in corporate responsibility, we're doing that at the cost of our business. I think our book clearly shows that that's not the case.
And the only thing I would add to that is understand and respond to your stakeholders. And it's easy to say, but it's, I think, quite challenging at the operational level. And I think if companies can figure out how to do that effectively, I think that would make a big difference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.